I think you should learn from my mistakes. So in this video, I'm going to go over 5 things that really slowed me down in learning jazz and that I now help students overcome so that they don't get stuck along the way. When I look at how my students are progressing, then it's easy to see that they get there a lot easier and a lot faster. And I'm sure I would have too. So you want to get this right. A lot of us come to jazz when we already play the instrument and have experience with other styles of music. And since jazz comes across as being difficult or complex, then we often choose to be the good student and try to do all the exercises, put in the work, and in that way get there. I really didn't get this right in the beginning and spent way too much time thinking about what scale to play over which chord and end up using it on a progression that was completely abstract to me. You already know that just playing a scale on arpeggio is not a solo phrase. The same goes for chords. You're not learning to comp by just learning a lot of inversions. Learning jazz is learning a musical language that you can't learn with just exercises, just like you won't learn Spanish by just reading a dictionary.
Okay.
So this will never magically lead to this. I think that's pretty obvious, and it means that you also need to learn some songs and some real music that you can play, because an arpeggio or any other exercise is not useful until you make it a part of the music. And you need to develop that skill as well. None of this will work if you just do exercises. And actually, the worst plan that I've ever heard from students, and I've actually heard that quite often, is before I start improvising, I first need to learn, and then you can insert all scales in all keys and positions, or all arpeggios in all keys, or all chords in all inversions. That just never works. I think you could probably say that the most important song to learn is the first song that you really learn. When I started out, then I wasn't told to really learn songs so that I could easily play them by heart and use them to develop my improvisational skills. That actually really slows you down. That's also why my course is a step-by-step guide teaching you that first song so that you will learn how to make music while you're also improvising solos. Now, besides learning songs and solo over them, then there's also another kind of overlooked approach when it comes to developing improvisation, and it's incredibly useful. I'm amazed at how rare it is to see this method suggested for people who want to improve their vocabulary and learn how to play better jazz lines with better phrasing. And speaking of phrasing, I actually have a few quick fixes for that later in the video as well. As a student, you're always told to practice slowly, and that is not any different for learning to improvise jazz solos. But the problem that we all run into is that songs are not played that slow. And you can't actually slow them down because then they don't make sense anymore. So how do you practice improvisation slowly? The answer to that is composition, which is essentially also how Barry Harris taught his masterclasses, composing bebop solos. If it's a good enough method for him, probably gonna be an okay exercise for you as well. Let me just demonstrate this with a practical example. And just to be clear, I still do this when I want to improve my own solo lines, which is most days of the week. Let's say that I want to get better at using this chromatic enclosure. So of course, the chromatic enclosure is just a short phrase that leads to a target note. In this case, the target note is C. And for now, I want to use this on a C major 7. Of course, you can use it on a lot of things, but let's just say that that's where we're going to start. In the beginning, you just want to hear how the phrase works, how it sounds when you put it into lines. Obviously, you can combine this with a C major 7 arpeggio. So that's already fine, but let's add a tail to that just to make it more of a phrase. But maybe it also works with a descending C major 7 arpeggio. And this works really well in combination with solos that you've learned by ear. If you take your favorite phrases and try to make your own version of them, then you're developing your sound. You're not just copying whoever you transcribed, and you're really getting it into your playing. Sometimes it can also be useful to write down what you compose, but you don't always have to. And I think the biggest benefit is the process. It's not the licks that you end up with, simply because you learn how to fit the things together, and that will later also come out in your solos, giving you a larger, more flexible vocabulary. When you're learning jazz, then there are things that are more important than what notes you play in a solo. I'll get back to that. But first, let's look at how you figure out how good or bad you actually are. One thing that I have to tell students all the time is that you can't play a solo and at the same time tell how you're doing. If you want to know how you sound, and trust me, you do, that's really practical to know, then you have to record yourself playing and listen back.
I've made a huge mistake.
This is incredibly useful for anyone trying to learn, but it's especially important if you're trying to teach yourself jazz guitar. To make it more effective, then there are a few things that you can keep in mind so that you don't get distracted by your own brain, or in fact your own ego, when you listen, because listening to yourself can be a bit weird and a bit difficult in the beginning. Record yourself often. You get used to this, so the first few times it's weird and you get stressed out by all sorts of things, but that actually goes away with time. Decide what you're working on and listen for that. So this is simple. If you're working on phrasing and rhythm, don't get distracted by what arpeggios you're using on also dominance. Focus on what you're working on. Don't listen right away. So often when you just played something, then you still remember what it felt like when you played it. And you're not actually listening to the recording, you're just reliving how it felt, which is not helping you at all. If you give it a day or two, then you have a little bit more distance and you can listen to how it actually sounds. And it is when you start recording yourself that you probably discover the next thing that you need to pay attention to. But I have a few quick fixes. This is often considered very difficult and vague, but it really doesn't have to be. I'm of course talking about jazz phrasing. You may already have run into this. I certainly remember when I felt like I was just hitting a wall with phrasing. I knew all the scales and arpeggios, but my solos and what I played just didn't sound right. When I was starting out learning jazz, then the first thing I got confronted with was that I couldn't follow the song. I couldn't follow the changes and I played a lot of wrong notes. So that stayed my focus for a very long time, but that also meant that I wasn't really paying attention to how the solo sounded, how I was phrasing those notes. Now this meant that I had to fix that later, and that was actually pretty difficult because I had all these other habits built in already. So it really makes sense to become more aware of this early on. And there are a few ways to work on this, and some of them are actually pretty easy. End on a short note. Now I say this at least 3 times a week in the roadmap community when I give feedback to people who posted solos. Bebop is called bebop because that's how the typical solo phrase ends, and that means that it's a short note, bebop. On guitar, it's kind of difficult to play long notes, so we focus on learning how to do that and we make that the habit. But in the end, you need to take control of the notes and only play long notes when that makes sense. Play solos with fewer notes. The easiest way to develop phrasing and rhythm is to take away the other variables so that you have to focus on phrasing and rhythm. It can be super useful to voice lead 2 or 3 notes through a song and then spend some time just soloing using only those 2 or 3 notes. That will help you get a lot more creative with phrasing, rhythm and dynamics. Learn solos by ear. If you want to hear better phrases, then learn some solid phrases by ear. Often the easiest solos to learn, like Charlie Christian and Grant Green, are also great for learning to hear good phrasing and creative rhythms. And the next topic will help you get a lot more out of what you learn by ear and what you come up with when you're composing lines. You have to stop being afraid of not understanding something, and you have to remember always to be curious about what is going on. When you're starting out learning jazz, then it's easy to try to learn a crazy amount of theory, but what you really want to learn is actually pretty simple. And if you know that, then it will teach you the rest, plus that you can learn it in a much more natural way. When I learned Stella by Starlight and There's No Greater Love, the first 2 songs that I learned, then I couldn't analyze them. But I still learned to play them, even if I only understood some of what was going on and I was playing a few wrong notes here and there. I didn't really care because I just wanted to play the music. And maybe that was one of the things that I actually managed to do right in this video. Start with really knowing the basics. So your basic scales, maybe just start with major. Then make sure that you also know the diatonic chords. From there, you can start to recognize things in the songs that you play. Take a song like There'll Never Be Another You. First, you look at what the key is, and then what makes sense just using that information. Then maybe you can learn what a secondary dominant or a secondary 2-5 is, and then there are a lot less gaps and actually only a few more tricks to learn. Then you have the whole song analyzed. And that's also the best way to learn music theory. Have it describe the music that you're already playing so that you can recognize it, so that you have a strong, natural connection to what that theory is about. Now, another place where theory and music really comes together and becomes something beautiful is when you start working on making your own chord melody arrangements. And this may seem scary at first, but it's actually not that difficult. You just want to start the right way so that you can create your own beautiful jazz chord melodies. If you want to develop that skill, then check out this video that also borrows a few tricks from Joe Pass.